The death penalty is a flawed and corrupt system in the United States Department of Justice and should be eliminated in respect for humanity. First of all, what is the death penalty? Well, it's a punishment of execution after convicting a capital crime with an eye for an eye mentality. Why is the eye for an eye mindset frowned upon? Well, the eye for an eye mentality will never solve anything. It's a revenge philosophy inevitably leading to endless cycles of violence. Also, how does our American criminal system work? Well, the system is divided into two groups, first degree and second degree murder. First degree murder is not intentional, it's accidental murders. This includes things such as road accidents, which are very common in everyday life. And second degree murder is an intentional killing that is not premeditated. This includes armed robbery, terrorists, serial killers, etc. The only crime punishable by death in America is some sort of criminal homicide. This was upheld in the Supreme Court in the 70s. Some history of the death penalty. The death penalty has greatly improved over the years, but still requires a boost. The total executions has greatly decreased over the years between 1930 and 1995. For example, Texas went from approximately 400 cases a year to about 100 cases a year, which is a great improvement. A century ago, capital punishment was a system of relatively inexpensive and probably much cheaper than the alternative of long-term prison. This explains the reason for more executions in the early 20th century because it saved money. A third of the 6 periods of our history, roughly from the Civil War to the earliest 20th century, witnessed no important changes or new trends affecting the death penalty. Anything before the early 20th century had little to no change on the death penalty. So for some flaws of the death penalty, it discriminates against most victims according to their race, gender, or religion. People who kill whites are far more likely to receive the death penalty than those victims who are not white, and blacks who kill whites have a greater chance of receiving the death sentence. This is a major discrimination against people who aren't white because they have a higher chance of receiving the death penalty according just to their skin color. Minorities are death sentence disproportionate to their numbers in the population. This is not primarily because minorities commit more murders, it's because they're often sentenced to death when they do. The death penalty is like a lottery, in which fairness always loses. Who gets the death penalty is largely determined not by the severity of the crime, but by race, sex, and economic class of the prisoner and victim. All of this evidence leads to believe that the death penalty is majorly discriminatory and needs to be eliminated. The death penalty is extremely cruel to the culprit. The Eighth Amendment of the Constitution prevents the use of cruel and unusual punishment. Many would interpret the death penalty as violating this restriction. This means that technically the death penalty is illegal and breaks one of the 10 amendments that the US was originally built on. Lethal injection is the latest technique, first used in Texas in 1982, and now mandated by law in a large majority of states that retain capital punishment. Although this method is defined as more humane, efficient, and inexpensive to others, one federal judge observed that even a slight error in dosage or administration can leave a prisoner conscious but paralyzed while dying. It's a sentient witness of his or her own asphyxiation. This means that misdosage could lead to a painful and cruel death, causing paralysis on the culprit, which certainly breaks the Eighth Amendment of the cruel and unusual punishment. Also, the death penalty affects the mental health of both criminals and executioners. Many people are simply born with defects to their brain and cause them to act in a certain way. No amount of drugs, schooling, rehabilitation, or positive reinforcement can change that. Is it fair that someone should be murdered just because they were unlucky enough to be born with a brain defect? Former wardens, guards, and execution team members reported severe brain damage to their mental and physical health because of the stress and trauma of participating in executions and killing prisoners. This takes a major effect on people. Watching others die in seconds can cause problems mentally. The death penalty traumatizes everyone it touches: victims, survivors, prosecutors, defense lawyers, prison workers, and families. Nobody wants to watch another person die, so it takes a toll on anyone involved in the process. So some solutions to the death penalty. Number one is respecting the victims. By abolishing the death penalty, we could focus our time, energy, and resources on supporting victims and families harmed by violence. We must ensure that all victims are treated fairly and with respect. This means that the U.S. should focus on helping people involved in the crime rather than ending the life of the culprit. We should also learn to give forgiveness. Forgiveness is the only way to start the healing process, and it won't happen in a revenge-focused individual. This means people should move on from the convicted crime so they can begin to heal and grow. Revenge using violence is never the answer because it's not going to change anything, and it's just as good as the first murder. Also, revenge doesn't really prevent the crime. Like, it is useless that it doesn't bring the victim back to life. It happened. There's no change in the past. So people just have to move on. There's no good reason to murder someone in spite of revenge. Also, jail is way more effective. With the death sentence, the suffering is over in an instant. With life in prison, the pain goes on for decades. Prisoners are confined to a cage and live in an internal environment of rape and violence where they are treated like animals. This is much more effective according to studies because the culprits have to live with the pain for the rest of their days alive in a prison cell. Today, the US criminal justice system helps keeping our country safe, but it has its flaws and problems, especially with the death penalty. The death penalty itself should be abolished after much reasoning, such as its discrimination, its cruelty, and its effects on people involved in the crime. The only way to stop it is by abolishing the penalty and moving towards forgiveness, helping the victim, and letting the culprit serve his or her time in prison to live with it. The only way to respect the humanity of the victims and the culprits on the other solutions to the problem besides death and revenge. Now I have a Kahoot that I'm going to set up. So let me screen share this. There we go. Okay. 8, 5, 5, 4, 6, 3, 9. Okay. There we go. So this is just a Kahoot game based on if you pay attention or not. Alrighty. So what is death penalty? It's obviously just execution. Punishment of execution, punishment of manual labor, punishment of jail time, punishment of rehabilitation. The execution. And then next, oops. What are the two groups of the American criminal system? How many death cases did Texas have in the early 20th century? 400. How does this penalty discriminate against others? Only happens to males, only happens to females, on the other hand, because X only happens to non-licensed people. True or false? Does the death penalty technically break the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment? Well, this is obviously true. The death penalty has no effect on the people involved in the execution on the prisoner. What is the solution to the death penalty? Abolishing it forever, forgiveness, helping the victims involved, all the above. Obviously, all the above. True or false? Is Miss Mcgowan the best Composition 12 teacher on the planet? Come on, what kind of questions? Who made this quiz? And that is it. So let me stop sharing that. All right. Thank you for listening. Take care.